Hello, I'm Dr. Claire Craig, and I want to take you through a quick presentation on COVID risk. A lot of people have overestimated their personal risk from COVID with devastating consequences. So this presentation is just going to present the facts on the risks of catching COVID, and then the facts on the chances of dying with COVID if you catch it for each age group. The data comes from the Medical Research Council's Biostatistics Unit at Cambridge University, and I put the links for it at the end. First of all, let's talk about how bad humans are at assessing risk. It's something we're not good at. We tend to focus on the worst outcomes and dangers get exaggerated. And that's what's protected us from an evolutionary perspective. It's good to mistake a stick for a snake in the woods momentarily, because that keeps us safe from danger. But in the situation we're in now, where people have been subject to mass fear propaganda, the risks have been exaggerated in people's minds in a very unhelpful way. And one way that's useful is to turn everything on its head, so that when I suggest to you that, say, you have a 1 in 40,000 chance of catching and dying with COVID in a particular wave, instead of focusing on that chance being related to a death, it's helpful to turn it around and think, well, if the government was offering a chance of winning £10 million and it was a 1 in 40,000 chance, how excited would I be about that prospect? Because when we think about positive outcomes, we have a more realistic view on risk. So what is the chance of catching it in any particular wave? Well, most people do not catch COVID with one wave. There have been many waves now throughout the world, and we've got plenty of data on this. And it shows that for previous variants, about 1 in 14 people catch COVID in any one wave. With some of the data from Omicron suggests it might be a little bit higher, something like 1 in 7 even. But let's put that into context. It would be like getting everybody in the population to pick a card from a pack of cards, and only those people who pick the number 2 will catch COVID. And with Omicron, it might be those that pick the number 2 or 3. But you can see that the vast majority of people are going to pick a different card, and they won't catch COVID in that wave. So every time we're going to talk about the risks, you have to bear in mind that the first thing is to spin this wheel, and only if it lands on, let's say, the bright pink segment, will you catch COVID. And only then would you be exposed to the risk of dying with it. Let's start with the youngest age groups, the under 5-year-olds. They have a risk, if they catch COVID, of dying with it of 1 in 270,000. That's the same order as the chances of being struck by lightning. It's a really difficult number to get your head around, 270,000, it's huge. So to help us do that, I think we should use baked beans. So here are 2 plates of baked beans. Between those 2 plates, there are 465 beans, which is how many beans you have in a single tin. So use that image when we're talking about the tins to help you visualize what the risk is. So if 270,000 under 5-year-olds all caught COVID, only 1 of them would die with it. That would be the equivalent to 1 baked bean out of 580 tins of baked beans. It's an incredibly low risk. And it's not the kind of odds you would want to chance your money on. Let's spin the wheel again now, this time for the 5 to 14-year-olds. So only a minority of them will catch COVID in any particular wave. Of those that do catch it, the risk of dying with it is 1 in 77,000. So let's return to the baked beans and see what that looks like. That is 1 baked bean in 165 tins of baked beans. To put it another way, it's the same order of magnitude as the risk of dying from a general anaesthetic. Now we'll go to the older ages. So we're going from 15 to 24. Again, the vast majority of these people will not catch COVID in any one wave, but around 7 to 15% will. And for them, the risk of dying with it is 1 in 29,000, which would be 1 baked bean out of 61 tins of baked beans. To put it another way, you would be 3 times more likely to pick a clover and find it has 4 leaves. You'd be 3 times more likely to open an oyster and find a natural pearl. You're more likely to reach your 100th birthday than to die with COVID if you catch it and you're age 15 to 24. For 25 to 44-year-olds, only a minority will catch it. And for that minority, 1 in 4,000 will die with it. That's 1 baked bean out of 17 platefuls of baked beans. To put it another way, if everybody who was 25 to 44 caught COVID was handed an egg, and you asked those who had a double yolk to step forward, and then those people had to draw a card from a pack, and those with a heart or a diamond or clubs would be fine, but the ones with a spade will die with COVID. That is what a 1 in 4,000 risk is like. To try to give it some other context, let's talk about some other risks. You never hear about snake bites in the UK. You never really hear about snakes in the UK, but the NHS report that there are 100 snake bite incidents every year. Now, if those 100 snake bite incidents were reported on the news every night, you might be genuinely scared of snake bites, but it would be ridiculous. They are incredibly rare. To compare it to other deaths, there are around 650 deaths a year from people falling downstairs. 650 murders take place every year and 200 people drown every year. And to compare that to COVID in 2021, there were 800 deaths with COVID in people under the age of 40, and fewer than 150 of them had no pre-existing conditions. As we move on to the older age groups, it's important to understand that the risk of dying with COVID has changed over time. What we've seen was that it was very high in the first peak deaths in spring 2020. It fell in the summer, it rose in the winter, it fell in the summer, and it's likely to rise again this winter. So there's a seasonality to this risk. Part of that is because transmission in hospitals and care homes, where the most vulnerable are, who are most likely to die with COVID if they catch it, has been worse in the winter. Also, different variants may well have played into these different outcomes, and it does look like Omicron is milder. So on top of this background of seasonal shifts, we need to add in that there may be some of the claimed benefit from vaccination. So looking at 45 to 64-year-olds, only a small minority will catch COVID in any one wave. Of that minority, the risk of dying with it ranged from 1 in 280 at the peak in winter 2020. But in December 2021, it's only 1 in 560. This is what that looks like. This is 1 in 280 and 1 in 560. To put it in another context, for 45 to 64-year-olds, if you catch COVID, it would be like being asked to draw 4 cards in a row from a pack of cards. And if all of them are kings, queens, and jacks, then you would have died of COVID at the peak. But more recently, it's much less likely you would have to pick 2 aces in a row from the pack. For 65 to 74-year-olds, again, only 7 to 15% of them will catch it. Of those who catch it, 1 in 43 died at the peak in 2020, but that has now fallen right down to 1 in 120. That's what they look like. So if you imagine those 120 beans actually each represent an individual aged 65 to 74 who has just caught COVID, only 1 of them will die with it. The rest will all survive. Another way to look at it, which was helpful with data from earlier in the pandemic, actually, when things were worse, is that the risk of dying if you caught it was about the same as your risk of dying from other causes over the course of the year anyway. It was an additional risk, but that was the same order of magnitude. So if you catch COVID, you should be as worried about dying with it as you were about dying this year. So for most of us, that's not a big concern. In fact, for children, it's even less than their risk of dying in the year of other causes. So to put it into context, at the peak, if you were aged 65 to 74 and caught COVID, it would be like placing your money on 0 in roulette and winning. And now it's even less likely. It's like the outsider at the Grand National with chances of more than 100 to 1 winning the Grand National. It's very unlikely. So now let's turn to the over 75-year-olds, who are the ones who are most at risk, that we're most worried about. Again, the vast majority of them will not catch COVID in any one particular wave. For the minority that do, the risk in the peak in 2020 was 1 in 5 of dying with it. And that has fallen right down to 1 in 29. So that's what those figures look like. Now, remember, even at the peak of 2020, when it was a 1 in 5 risk of dying, 80% of people who caught it survived. So to put it into another context, that 1 in 29 figure is the equivalent of flipping a coin 5 times in a row and getting heads every single time. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that throughout this, all of the data has not taken into account comorbidities. We know that people with comorbidities are at much greater risk of dying, which means that if you're perfectly healthy, your risk is even lower than the figures that have been presented here. Also, we've taken no account of early treatments, and we know that there are early treatments which reduce these risks still further. Now, if we go back to what I said at the beginning about judging things not by a bad outcome, but by a good outcome, imagine that instead of a fear of dying if you caught COVID, we could present the same data and say, well, what was your chances of winning £10 million? And all you have to do is flip a coin and it come up heads this many times. So this is what it would be for each age group in order to achieve that risk. So for the under 5s, you have to get ahead 18 times in a row. And I think that that's quite a helpful analogy because people can see how unlikely that really would be. This is where the data was from, the Medical Research Council Biostatistics Unit at Cambridge University. I used a report from the 9th of December 2021 for the most recent data, and their report from the 14th of January when the data was the most pessimistic for the peak in the winter last year. If you found this useful and you know people who are overly scared of their risk from COVID, please do share it with them. Thank you.